Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. We try to organize every episode through a theme. And of course, as has happened throughout this season, they're not just one thing. And so, say an episode about comedy and anti-Zionism becomes both that and so much more. This idea was particularly true for today's guest, Hannah Mermelstein. I thought Hannah would be a great guest to talk about co-founding Birthright Unplugged, which is an organization that offers amazing counter-education to Birthright Israel. And also, Hannah ended up talking about many other things, whether Birthright Unplugged, Librarians with Palestine, her work with Families for Ceasefire, her many zines, or even her fight with her former employer, a Quaker school that preferred silence and complicity to justice and actually listening to students' curiosity. Hannah practices a kind of education grounded in justice, one bound to critical reflection, listening, and solidarity. So here's Hannah Mermelstein sharing all of that and so much more. Hannah Mermelstein, welcome to Another Education is Possible. How are you doing?
Thank you, Jordan. Doing all right. How are you?
Yeah, doing okay-ish. Great. So let's start all the way at the beginning for you. What did Judaism, Zionism, and Palestine look like for you growing up as a fellow Philadelphia area child?
It was definitely in that order of Judaism, Zionism, and then Palestine, although the Zionism came pretty early. I grew up at a Reconstructionist Jewish synagogue in the Philadelphia suburbs. My family was very Jewish. We did Shabbat at home pretty often. I was the kid who at synagogue loved everything but knew it wasn't cool to love it. So I would be like singing under my breath in the back, covering my mouth. But I loved all of those things until it came into conflict with me, not originally about Palestine, but other things. There's gender, there's all kinds of things that I started to question. But my Judaism, it was positive for me at the beginning. There was definitely a sense of I'm different because I'm Jewish, and that was a positive thing also, even though my suburban public high school was close to 40% Jewish, I think, in Upper Dublin. There was still the sense of like Jewish outsider. And then within that, being Reconstructionist was like outsider within that, which is a little bit ironic, I think, because Reconstructionism is founded on the concept, on getting rid of the concept of the chosen people. But it very much felt like this chosen people idea, this idea of the exceptionality of Jews and the belonging that it creates, that I think also contributes to Zionism as well. So grew up going to synagogue, and also then going to the Israeli Independence Day parades with my synagogue. So there was definitely, a few years into my Jewish education, very much was tied up with Israel. I don't think I knew I didn't learn a lot about Israel. It was just like, here's this parade we go to. It's fun. We sing on the bus with our friends. And then I really started to learn more when I started going to Zionist summer camp. So the movement Habonim Dror, the camp here is Galil. So I started after 8th grade was the first, which is a little older than some people start at that camp. And I loved it because it was questioning capitalism and teaching us revolution and critical thinking and all of this stuff. But all of that then is tied up with Zionism. So I'm taught that that's what Israel is. The kibbutz movement was this socialist utopia. They wanted it to be all Hebrew labor and not rely on the indigenous population. So I was very drawn into camp. I was drawn into the idea of Israel as a socialist utopia. There are many of us now, anti-Zionist Jews, who grew up in Habonim, who I think were taught all these critical thinking skills that then eventually taught us to question Zionism. them all together. But at the time, that's kind of where it landed. And we're talking also mid-90s. It's during the Oslo peace process. Habonim is pro two states. We think we're very, progressive and liberal, but just kind of stayed that way. And my awakening around Palestine was really during the Second Intifada. So in the fall of 2000, I was studying abroad in Nicaragua and studying about revolution. The program I was doing was like revolution and social change, and learning all about the ways in which the US has messed up the world, and particularly Latin America and Nicaragua. And I'm there, and the Second Intifada starts, and I'm watching it being covered on CNN, BBC, and the local Nicaraguan media. And I'm like, wow, all three of these are very different, and showing me things that I've thought about and that seemed to go against the values I've been taught by my Zionist youth movement. And this is the early days of email, but there was email, and I sent an email to the email list of the Habonim email list, and I said, how can we justify this? Like, I understand we're all probably against the severity of Israel's responses right now, but even Zionism at all, like, how do we explain a Jewish state? And it was not a rhetorical question. I was really struggling. I felt connected. I wanted to have an answer, and nobody responded. And that was kind of the beginning of my breakup with Zionism. I skipped actually a very important part, which was that I deferred college for a year and spent the year in Israel with Habonim, so doing their program that they encourage everyone to do called Workshop, living on kibbutz most of the time, and really not questioning a whole lot, not learning a whole lot there. It was very much for me about the internal experience of the 40 some of us trying to live in a socialist way with each other rather than where we were. That was the late 90s. So then now we're in the early 2000s. I'm learning about Palestine a little bit. I'm seeing it in the news. I went to Goucher College in Baltimore. So I get back to Goucher, and I remember for Israeli Independence Day, Hillel was set up in the main, student center. And I had been involved in Hillel in the past. I had taught a lot of those folks Israeli dancing. They set up and started doing Israeli dancing, which now I know to be at least in large part appropriated from, it's a lot of things, right? It's European, but it's also Arab and Palestinian. But they're doing Israeli dancing. They're giving out falafel. And I didn't know a lot, but I knew that something was wrong by that point. And I went and I looked, I was like, there must be some other way that Palestinians think of Israeli independence. And I looked it up, and that was the first time I heard the word Nakba. So this is 2002. And three other people so Goucher was a place, at least at the time, that had a very large Jewish population, some of which were involved Jewishly and some of which weren't. And a very small, no organized Arab or Muslim population at all. Definitely no SJP or anything like that. And so it was three other Jews and I, all of whom actually had been part of Habonim in the past, who spent hours and hours agonizing over this tiny little paragraph we wrote that was we are Jews, we have spent time in Israel, we are questioning now what's happening. It seems wrong to celebrate Israeli independence right now. Here's the word Nakba, here's what it means to Palestinians. Tiny little thing, slip of paper, and we handed it out in the student center next to where Hillel was tabling, and got a lot of antagonistic responses. And that was scary for me, but also a very big moment for me in starting my anti-Zionist journey. I would not have called myself anti-Zionist yet, but definitely questioning.
I love encountering throughout these conversations the sources of people's breakups with Zionism. I love that going to Nicaragua is one for you. Of course, the Sandinistas were in power at the time, but it sounds like that kind of radical history was part of your education there. And certainly the media of empire is going to be radically different from what you're encountering. Where did that lead you? And I think I'd also be interested in knowing kind of how did you push through? Because I hear from a lot of people that opposition, that pushback from folks like Hillel feels like this just isn't worth it. I don't want to cause problems.
I think once I decide that something is right or wrong, I have a hard time going back about it. I mean, I don't like personal conflict actually, but my sense of like rightness and wrongness overshadows that. I was uncomfortable, but I had I had a few other people with me, and then just kind of like broke off from the other people or organizations that I had been part of. I don't actually remember all the details of that time. I do. I mean, throughout the years, like there are people I've lost. I'm lucky with my immediate family that they've mostly come along the journey with me.
So once you start doing these things like tabling, learning about the Nakba, where does that lead you both at Goucher and after you finished undergrad?
Yes, that was towards the end. I didn't really do any activism there. After I left, I moved to Boston, actually doing something, the Jewish Organizing Initiative, which is like community organizing in a cohort and then also learning about Judaism and organizing together. So I was doing that program for a year in Boston, and at that time started attending report backs from people who had been to Palestine, like films. ISM, the International Solidarity Movement, had begun recently, and I went to a report back from ISM, and that kind of changed everything. So I was somebody who I think both strong sense of right or wrong and also very privileged, aware of my privilege in certain ways and the ways it can be used, and also like a false sense of my own importance. Even in college, like I remember when 9/11 happened, a friend and I wrote a petition to Bush to respond nonviolently, got everyone on campus to sign it, and did all this. And then once the U.S. started bombing Afghanistan, I was like going around to different departments at school, asking them to fund me to go to Afghanistan and like stand there and block the bombs. So that was sort of my inclination. And my professors are like, okay, like you can't actually do that. One of my professors, she said, it's too late to stop this war. We need to stop the next war, which will be in Iraq. And she was right. And we didn't stop that. So there was so there's that sense, right? So then ISM really spoke to me. So ISM was, it's internationals going in a protective presence kind of way to communities in Palestine that were being attacked and that, staying for a certain amount of time. It's changed over the years. And so I was going to those report backs and then learned about the International Women's Peace Service, IWPS, which had a similar model, but it was all women. It was in a small rural village and had a long-term presence model. ISM then moved towards that. But at the time, it did not. So IWPS was like, we're here. This is where we live in this one village, and we kind of work in these villages around here that are often affected by soldiers, settlers. It wasn't like the big army incursions because it was more rural. It was more, they built a settler road right by my olive trees. So we need people to come during the olive harvest or whatever else, like a lot of kind of face-to-face harassment. And then that ended up being the place where they also started building the wall, which was right around that time when they started building the apartheid wall.
So a lot of accompaniment was happening.
Yes. Yes. So I made the decision to go with IWPS as a volunteer. I was preparing to go, and then Rachel Corrie was killed. And that really affected me. It was actually my grandmother heard it first on the news, called my mom. My mom called me, and it was like, someone who's doing exactly what you're about to do just got killed. And of course, it wasn't exactly in the sense that she was in Gaza and I was going to the West Bank, and there was a difference, but similar kind of work. So I was scared, but I decided to go. And that first time, it was very much about me and figuring out my identity, right? So I would go, I mean, I cringe now, like I spoke very little. I learned a very tiny bit of Arabic before I went, but very little. But I'd go around and just introduce myself to random like farmers, taxi drivers, anyone, and be like, hi, I'm Hannah, I'm Jewish and I'm not Israeli. And they're like, okay, great. Thanks for being here. Nobody cared. But I definitely was very much centering myself in that experience. And that shifted over time. But at the time, I thought it was like, I'm going once, I'm going to figure this out, and then I'm going to go home and continue with my life. And then went for the first time, and it kind of became my life for a lot of different reasons.
So this clearly wasn't a one-time thing then. Are you hinting at what became Birthright Unplugged?
Before Birthright Unplugged. So the first time I was there, it was during the olive harvest time. It's actually a lovely time. to be there and accompanying farmers. And there were some times when there were confrontations with settlers or soldiers, but that first trip felt as scary as I thought it would be, which was not the case then in my next trip. But that was the first time. And people would say to me, thank you for being here. This is great that you're here with us, in our olive groves, but really you need to go and change policy in the US and tell more people, tell everybody about this. Like there weren't a lot of people there, a lot of foreigners there at the time, which led me then to delegation work. Cause it's like, what are ways to tell other people? Well, you grow you have people come for short periods of time, go back home and kind of expand the work that way, very much like an educational perspective. So I went home, and then I was working with the Boston Committee for Palestinian Rights and organized a delegation with them. And so I led that the following summer. This was 2004. And I went again to work with IWPS. This time was much scarier because they had started building the wall, but they were still denying that Israel was denying that they were building it. And the only way maps were being made from just a farmer calling up an organization and being like, hey, I got to my land this morning and my trees were gone, or there was a demolition order. And so people started like drawing these maps, but in that northern region around like Kalkilia, Salfit, Nablus area, there were all these then impromptu demonstrations. We'd get a call in the morning that's like, my trees are gone, or they're here building the wall right now on my land. All the shabab, all the young men are like running towards them, this impromptu demonstration, you need to come and document, witness, intervene, whatever. So we did. It was a lot of tear gas, a lot of other weapons used against us, not live ammunition, probably because there were internationals and often Israelis there in a protective presence kind of way. I did that and then did a program where I lived with a family in a refugee camp, in Dahisha refugee camp in Bethlehem. It was like a month-long studying Arabic, living with a family. And that really changed a lot for me in a few different ways. So one was like, I'm developing these relationships with people that aren't just, I remember one time the army came into Dahisha while I was staying there and we heard, the army's here. And I immediately put my shoes on and I'm about to go out. My host mother's like, where do you think you're going? That's not what you're doing here. So it was a different role. I was also learning more Arabic that was not just about occupation, but about like daily life and developing relationships with people and living in a refugee camp. I didn't really understand the refugee issue at all before then. After that is when I started saying, okay, I'm definitely anti-Zionist. And that feels more clear to me. There's a clarity and consistency that comes once you reach anti-Zionism that I was afraid to speak about it at first, thinking that the pushback would be worse or something. But I find that like the trolls are the trolls either way. And that consistency really does help. But that was my experience that time, and then led my first delegation. Then Dunya, who was a colleague of mine from IWPS, she and I were talking one time and she said, my aunt's going on this free trip to Israel, like with her synagogue. Isn't that weird? And I was like, well, that's like, there are a lot of those. And there's this thing called Birthright Israel. She hadn't heard of it. I knew of it. I told her about it. And she's like, well, we should do something to counter that. And that was the foundation of Birthright Unplugged. So the idea at first with Birthright Unplugged was taking young Jews, like targeting the same group that Birthright Israel was, which were Birthright Israel's rules were like 18 to 26-year-old Jews, show them Israel on this 10-day trip. They then encouraged people to extend their tickets and stay longer. So we're like, okay, extend your ticket. That part's free. Extend your ticket and then come with us on this 5-day trip, meeting with Palestinian people. And so that was the start of Birthright Unplugged. We had like 4 people on our first trip, 5 people on our second trip, very, very in the early days. We did that for a few years and it shifted over time because very shortly after we started is when the BDS call came out. And then it became very clear that Palestinians were encouraging people not to go on Birthright Israel, even though it's a free trip and even if they were going to do something good with it. And so then we started saying, okay, don't actually go on Birthright Israel. Raise the money for your plane ticket and then just, come on Birthright Unplugged. And then shifted even beyond that to not only focusing on Jews as our kind of target audience. And the idea behind Birthright Unplugged being challenging this idea of a Jewish birthright to Palestinian land, basically in a place where Palestinians are not allowed to return and Jews are encouraged to quote unquote return.
Before we really get into what Birthright Unplugged does, I'm wondering if there's something maybe a little bit more in you're becoming anti-Zionist? It sounds like it might be a little bit more complex than what was going on there that really solidified your anti-Zionism?
The seeds of it were already there in that email that I sent right when I was, starting to question back in the fall of 2000. Or the spring of 2001, whenever it was that I actually sent that. But of like just thinking logically, how does it make sense? How can a Jewish state also be democratic, right? That was the core question. And then I guess I like sort of pushed it aside a little bit. Just didn't have a lot of information about, I didn't know a lot about Palestinian citizens of Israel. I didn't know a lot about Palestinian refugees. I didn't know that most Palestinians are refugees, that most Palestinians, even who are in Palestine, are internally displaced or refugees within the West Bank and Gaza. And so having that, and I also didn't realize kind of how entrenched it all was. So that was part of when I was living in Dehesha, it didn't look like what I thought a refugee camp would look like. When I think refugee camp, you think tents, and it's not. It hasn't been tents since the 1950s. And so just realizing what Zionism means in this very permanent way to Palestinian people, it can't be justified. When I finally thought about, like, there are all these Palestinian people here, like the vast majority of the indigenous population are Palestinian. A Jewish democratic state is not a thing that can happen on a land where the vast majority of the indigenous population is Palestinian. So it was both. So that there was like the logical aspect, and then all the unlearning that has to be done. And even once I was calling myself anti-Zionist, there are still things over the years that would come up where I'm like, oh yeah, but that story of like, just the story of Israel being the underdog and the 48 war and all the things I learned about like the Israeli, pre-Israeli military, whatever it was, like people sending tractors up. There's a story I learned about sending tractors up a hill with their lights on to like the top of the hill. I don't know if it's Golan or it's like somewhere in the north. And then turning the lights off, it's like nighttime, turning the lights off, going back down the hill, then turning the lights on and going back up. So it makes it look like there's a ton of military power, but really it's just these couple tractors. And so it's this like little Israel using their creativity to defeat all the Arab armies. And that was still that particular story I thought about like a couple of years after I was already anti-Zionist. And I'm like, oh, that's probably apocryphal. And certainly like in the scheme of why did Israel become Israel and defeat the Arab armies, the Palestinians, whatever, like that is not the reason.
I always have, in even more abstract terms, I always have, of course I'm anti-Zionist. We fully need to unmake the state of Israel. But we do need a safe place to go when they come for us, right? Like you find these little nuggets of the narrative that this settler colonial structure has built into us that it's like, oh, let's ignore actually long periods of coexistence with other groups. Let's ignore every other narrative that we see in front of us and still come back to this idea that helps prop up Zionism.
That's interesting. That particular part, I know that's a big part for a lot of people. It's a little less so for me. I didn't ever really feel threatened as a Jew by anyone other than other Jews. And this is even pre like questioning Zionism. This was like, when I'm trying to remember which. So I also went on the first Zionist trip that they do in Habonim is between 10th and 11th grade. It's the summer. So I did that as well. So one of those trips, we were, I don't know, it was just like the separation of genders at the Western Wall, right? And we're like trying to pray, and we're told we can't pray, and we're not real Jews and whatever because we're women, and like that was my first like, well, screw this, like this is not my Judaism. You're like making me feel like I'm not a real Jew for all these other reasons.
You and I kind of grew up in very similar geographies and time periods. I have been incredibly safe in Philadelphia, New York, outside Boston. Where are Jews safer than this? But that narrative was still built into me, right? It's still very much well, of course, your experience and your family's experience tell you one thing, but we're going to remind you that actually you're never safe. Therefore, yada, 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 Israel.
That's
handy.
definitely
Yeah.
true of my Jewish education, of which it's been so frustrating to see it coming back post October 7th, where I feel like Jewish education sort of moved away from it. This idea of like, you have to be Jewish because they tried to kill you, right? They tried to kill us, and that's why we're Jewish. Nothing like no positive associations with Judaism. And I feel like Jewish education, even mainstream Jewish education, has moved away from that a bit in the past couple decades, and now it's like fully back there.
Which maybe helps us get back to some of the organizational and educational goals of Birthright Unplugged, because a key educational feature of Birthright when I went was, hey, there aren't a lot of Jews, therefore you should all, like, in a very, I've talked about this on other episodes of the podcast, really creepy, like a kind of a sex cult vibe happening, countering that. What does, it sounds like that went through several iterations, but what did Birthright Unplugged look like, and what were kind of its educational goals?
Yeah. So there's both the messaging around it in general that isn't about the specific trip, but about like, we are challenging this idea of a Jewish birthright to a land that is Palestinian and that they're not allowed to return to. Which an important part of that also is the Replugged program that we did with Palestinian kids, of taking them back to their villages, to Jerusalem and to the sea. And we're able to do that because of this kind of loophole in Israeli law, where when you're under 16 and you don't yet have a Hawiyah, you don't have an ID card yet, you technically are not forbidden from traveling, but you don't usually have anyone to take you. Now, I don't know that it would be possible anyway. Like, I'm not sure how it has changed, but at the time, it was, it could be up to the individual soldier at the checkpoint, but in general, we would travel with copies of these kids' birth certificates, and we would get through. They were counterparts to each other, these two programs. But for the Unplugged trip, what it looked like was trying to provide kind of as full a picture as we can in just a few days of the different kinds of Palestinian experiences. So making sure we're doing, cities, villages, refugee camps, Palestinian citizens of Israel, a few Jewish Israelis who are kind of challenging what is happening, and giving people that understanding of occupation, colonization, apartheid, all of that, and then having them kind of make commitments for when they go back home. Usually on the last day, we'd have people write down their commitments for the next 6 months, and then we'd collect them and mail them to them, 6 months later, and keep in touch with folks that way. But a lot of the people who did become like Jewish anti-Zionist leaders in the movement, and who still are people who actually came through Birthright Unplugged. So that's, going to the JVP conference a couple months ago in Baltimore, just going around and seeing so many people who came on Birthright Unplugged was really, it feels good to see that, to know that like it had this particular effect. It's many years later, the situation is worse than ever, so it's hard to evaluate effectiveness in that way, but just seeing the movement grow through that, to be there in solidarity and to do so in a way that isn't like harmful to Palestinian communities.
I do want to just pick up on one thing you said, that in preparing for this interview, it was both really depressing because, as you said, it's hard to evaluate outcomes given how dire the situation is now. But it was at least interesting to look back at some of your articles from Electronic Intifada and see names in 2006 who I now see very visibly in spaces like JVP. But yeah, in terms of Birthright Unplugged, how did you navigate making sure that you're not putting educational labor on Palestinians to do answer all the questions for me? It sounds like it was partially an application. And then conversely, I'm wondering how you set up the kind of educational goals. Because of course there's going to be a filtering of, you have to apply to the program. So you have to have some awareness. But if you think of Zionist summer camp, Hana, hearing the word settler colonialism, that's not going to register. So did you adapt the curriculum to each group? Did you navigate like, okay, we can be more forceful with these folks, we can challenge them? Or is there just kind of this is what it is, let's set goals around that?
I think it was more, this is what it is. We weren't trying to, again, because we're not trying to bring people who are going to, like, we want people to have a certain amount of education before they come. And that was always maybe the very first trips, it was like, we want anyone who's interested. It's self-selecting, right? They'll come. But pretty quickly, we adjusted that to really, I mean, we had plenty of people asking like cringy questions to folks that we met with. And there's a degree to which Palestinians know. So to answer to the other question, we developed the program with Palestinians we had relationships with. We got contacts from other contacts. Many of the people, and then there were certain people who we knew, and we would tell our participants sometimes, if you have, this is a person you can ask any question to. We would do a training at the beginning or like an orientation in which we're like, okay, like, here's what we expect. Here's what we, discourage. But we would tell people, here's a person you can ask anything to. And there were people who were like, I'm fine with bring Zionists here. That's totally fine. I'll debate them. I'll teach them. I'll, whatever. So it really depended on like who we were meeting with. And we got to know that. It's a little bit hard because Palestinians, it's a stereotype, but it's true, are very welcoming. So if we ask our friends, our colleagues, our contacts, do you want us to keep doing this? Do you want us to keep bringing groups? The answer is like, ahlan wa sahlan, welcome. There were a few people who we were able to really talk to of like, is this really what you want to keep doing after so many years? And this is where my work kind of shifted, and I started doing less delegation work and started doing more BDS work in the US after several years, was because there were a lot of people then. When we started it, there were not a lot of internationals there. At that point, then there were a lot of internationals. There were delegations. There was also like a lot of aid work. There were a ton of internationals just living it up in Ramallah. And I would like walk down, I would be living there for a couple months at a time while we were leading delegations, and I would be judging everyone else. And I'm like, I am them. Like, what am I doing? And so I feel like, the balance kind of tipped in that other direction at some point. And there was definitely a sense among some of the people we met with that was like, I have told my story. There's this family, the Amer family in Munira Amer, who lives in this village, Masha, like in the northern rural West Bank. Her house is like on the edge of the village. And when Israel built the wall, they were going to build it between her and the settlement, like between the village of Masha and the settlement that was built on their land. But the settlement is very close. And the settlers were like, we don't want the wall right there. Like, move it back a little. So they built the wall on the other side of the house between Munira's house and the rest of the village of Masha. There's another fence then. Obviously, they can't let her like go into the settlement or go into Israel through there. So they have a fence there. So she's basically surrounded on all four sides. This has been since like 2000, 2003, 2004. The only reason the house was not demolished in this whole process was that there were a bunch of Israeli activists who set up a peace camp and did this whole thing there. This is in like spring of 2003. But she's been living for over 20 years now, completely surrounded. She's got like one key. It used to be she had to call the army to get them to open the gate to let her into her village. Then they finally gave her one key. And we would go and visit with her, like every delegation. So she's someone I got to know through my IWPS work. We would go visit with her. But also because of just this, like, it's a microcosm of the whole occupation. It's this very extreme situation. There would be like European Parliament members coming and visiting with her and lots of other people who you would think would have influence, and nothing was changing. And she was like, this is really frustrating. She also started making olive oil soap and some other things. And so we continued to bring groups to her, but it was economically beneficial to her then at that point. It was like, this is a place where we encourage all our delegates to shop. But ultimately, I slowed down my delegation work and then also kind of made it more specific leading into then the librarians delegations, because of this idea of there's a fine line between solidarity and occupation tourism or voyeurism.
Yeah, you did the hosting work for me. That's a perfect transition because I could ask a million more questions about Birthright Unplugged. I think it's fascinating, and you're delving into the complexity and nuances and kind of permanent tensions of it. But I think there's so much other work that you've also done. So let's start with, what is Librarians for Palestine?
When I was doing fewer delegations, I had a conversation with someone at one point where it was like, what are you going to do after the revolution? Like, what's the next when everything's good, then what? And I'm like, I'm going to become a librarian. And then I started looking into it. Like, maybe I could do that before everything's great. Like, maybe I can become a librarian in this world. And so I went to library school. I became a librarian. It was mostly separate for me, though. I mean, other than like, there's the underlining like self-determination and access and that kind of stuff that I feel like is value-wise connects to, but the work was very separate. And was working as a librarian for a couple of years, and then a friend who's also a librarian was like, well, why don't you do a librarians delegation to Palestine? And I had literally never thought of it. And so that's where Librarians and Archivists with Palestine came from. I partnered them with the Palestinian American colleague friend to organize it, and it was Librarians and Archivists to Palestine. So we weren't trying to start an organization. We didn't know what would come of it. It was just the delegation. So this is 2013, about 15 of us went from like 4 different countries, mostly American, and it was connecting with our counterparts there. So there was a bit of the educational learning about the context and the occupation and all of that, but a lot of our meetings were very focused on libraries, archives, information work, cultural institutions, that kind of thing. A lot came from it in terms of both some ongoing relationships and then also like a lot of different creation of posters and zines and reports, and we ended up deciding, okay, we want to make a network of librarians and archivists. So we changed the name to Librarians and Archivists with Palestine and created this network and invited others to join. We developed some principles. We said anyone who self-identifies as a library or information worker who agrees with these principles can join our network. We did another delegation in 2015. There was, one that we did for several years called Matlub, which it was mostly about raising awareness about these struggles that libraries in Palestine have getting literature in Arabic. Like, especially children's literature is mostly published in Lebanon. Things from Lebanon aren't allowed into Israel. There's all kinds of expenses that, I don't know if it's tariffs or whatever, but taxes that they pay at the borders to get things in. So things are very expensive. And so it was a concrete thing where we had wish lists from different libraries and we were buying the books, but in that process also saying like, look, this is way more expensive than a book you would buy here, and here's why. Here's the journey it has to go on. But we did actually move some books to libraries in that way. So that's one of the things we have this campaign that's still going on the One Book Many Communities campaign based on, a lot of libraries, a lot of cities do it. We encourage people to read Palestinian literature. We pick a book every spring and we read it and have resources that we provide to groups that sign up to do it. We've done reports. More recently, there was a report that we did in January 2024 about the destruction of libraries and archives in Gaza. We, as a network, we opened it up for people to join. And for that first decade, we were just around like 180 people who in the network. And then since October 7th till now, we now have like 850. There's an organization for every profession or identity now around Palestine, which is great. Like the movement is growing, but that's been an adjustment for us. We have this tiny steering committee, no staff, and we are working on figuring out that structure and how to sustain the future of it.
What's the current book?
So this year's book was They Called Me a Lioness, a Palestinian for Freedom by Ahed Tamimi and Dina Takrori.
Yeah,
so that was this year's, yeah. And then last year it was Things You May Find Hidden in My Ear by Musab Abu Toh.
There's this just natural connection. It seems like librarians and zine makers are, I don't know how to put it, but they're deeply linked. It was a real joy to encounter your website and see some of your zines. Can you talk about that in relation to generally like your librarian work and kind of how this fits into the broader Palestine solidarity work?
Mm-hmm. My work as an actual, I was a school librarian for many years. I actually left my job a year ago because of Palestine and the institution's response to what was happening. But I was a school librarian. I didn't do a whole lot of zine related stuff there. Although actually in my first job where I worked for 10 years as a school librarian, I mostly worked with sort of upper elementary and middle school, but I did do a high school seminar on Palestinian cultural work. So it was a school at St. Anne's in Brooklyn that encourages teachers to kind of teach their passions, right? So there was this like unpaid class you could teach, this seminar, and then the high schoolers could take it and not get credit for it either. It was this like labor of love thing. So I did a seminar in Palestinian cultural works, and I had the students make zines. I find it an accessible, like a fairly easy thing to make, a fairly easy thing to consume, to read, and just like an accessible way to share information, and also creative. I mean, it can be I really like to write. I'm not usually as much of a visual person, so I'm not doing zines the way I did with my friends in the mid 90s where we're literally cutting and pasting, right? I'm doing it, in Microsoft Word or something. But I like that format. It's digestible, DIY, like all of that stuff. I have my master's thesis, which was about Palestinian stolen books. My favorite format of it. Then wrote articles. I had other, it was published in the Jerusalem Quarterly, but my favorite format is the zine that I made about it.
I could pick up on a few. I'm wondering in particular about this one that's just a series of emails and a series of reflections from when you were, I think it was you were an election observer in Gaza, is that right? It made me think about this kind of longevity.
I can think how that one came about. The Gaza writings one was because in these past couple of years of again being so engaged in Palestine stuff, it was very consistent for years. And then I had kids, and I was a librarian here with a full-time job, still doing activist work here, but I had not been back to Palestine since 2015 until last summer. But my first kid was born in 2016. So it was a slow kind of reduction of Palestine work, and then the pandemic hit, and then we had a second kid, and then we moved to Philly, where I'm from the area originally, but was not as connected and had a new job, and I did not get reconnected. I wasn't doing any Palestine work for basically a couple of years until October 2023. And as I started to again, everything felt very familiar to me, and it's being presented as though everything's new, and history started on October 7th. And so I started looking back at my own writings because I'm like, I know I've said these things before. So I started looking back, and then some of the stuff I found useful to share with people, because it really, in many ways, feels exactly the same, other than the scale of the destruction. I'll read a whole thing that could have been written today, and then it's like, oh my gosh, there have been like several hundred people killed, right? And it's like, oh my God, like several hundred people, like it's, hundreds of thousands. And but otherwise it was very similar. And so there was the desire to share that. And then also the idea that history started October 7th, that Hamas is this like boogeyman that can't be understood at all. The only time I've ever been to Gaza was these 2 days, ostensibly as an elections observer. That was the way we were able to get in, and that was the parliamentary election in which Hamas won. And so I was there for a couple of days, did some writing there, and so I wrote about that election. I was like, this seems useful to share, just like just to, I don't want to say humanize it, like I don't like that, but like this was the human experience of people at the time. Like, people are excited to vote. Everyone's like excited about democracy. People are kind of nervous about Hamas, but they're like, Fatah's so corrupt, and all of just like the nitty gritty of that. Like, it's not, I wanted to demystify it for people. And so sharing that, and then also looking at all the other things I had written about Gaza, because right after that is when the siege really intensified. Gaza started being bombed very, intensely every couple of years. And so just the writings that I did between 2006 and 2009 about Gaza, I put into a zine. I don't really know if anybody's read it other than you, but
yeah,
on my
website. It's on your website. Hannah Mermelstein is easily searchable. It's very much worth a read. I'm wondering if you're okay talking about your former job.
Yeah.
So, kind of the opposite of zines being these publicly available, very open, very challenging works, it sounds like your job, which espouses those values since 2023, has done the opposite. And well, I'll leave it open so I'm not stepping on your toes.
I worked as a 4th through 8th grade librarian at Germantown Friends School for 3 years. So since I moved back here until a year ago. And it's a Quaker school. Quakers are supposedly pacifist, also have like a number of, social justice related values that they stand by. And you would think that it would be okay to say the word ceasefire on campus, and it was not. And I wasn't trying to organize on campus. I was trying to have conversations because it felt very stifling. It very quickly started to feel like, don't talk about it. Don't bring it up. Not with kids, not with each other, not with colleagues. Just don't talk about it. It's too complicated. It's too controversial, which doesn't feel like that's in the Quaker spirit or in the educational spirit, right? Like, what is the message we're sending to our kids then? Like, this is an educational institution. We should be able to have conversations. And in those early days, there were some that were able to be had that were great. There was like one conversation I was able to have with kids, and it was because they were supposed to go to Ellis Island. And it was a day that Hamas and others had called for a day of rage, of like protests. And everyone got all up in arms here about like, Hamas is going to attack us. They're going to attack the US. They're going to attack New York. And it seemed completely ridiculous, but that everyone was on high alert. And they canceled the trip to Ellis Island. And I had already, so the thing that I did do on campus first, I had sent out an email to the faculty just like on October 11th or something, saying, hey, I'm somebody, like, this is on behalf of me, not on behalf of the library. I'm someone who has a lot of experience in the area. I grew up as a liberal Zionist. I'm now anti-Zionist. I've spent lots of time in Israel and the West Bank and a tiny bit in Gaza. And I'm happy to talk to anybody who's thinking about this stuff right now. And I was immediately called in to the office, like, you can't do this. And I'm like, why? And they say it's not, the email list isn't secure. It's like it got forwarded to parents. And I said, well, I don't really have a problem with parents knowing that I'm offering to have conversations with my colleagues. I'm not trying to hide that, but it was a problem for the administration. So then this continued for months of like, you need to make our lives easier by just shutting up. But because I had sent that email, there were people on campus knew that I could be approached, talked to. There would be all these like, secret people would come up and be like, thank you for that. Like very sort of secret. But this one teacher was like, hey, it was the 5th grade. I already worked with the 5th grade. I know all the kids. She said, we're thinking about having an optional discussion at lunchtime just to discuss like world events. Like, what are kids thinking about? Will you come do that with them? So I did. I made sure she stayed because I knew that there could be, I was like, I don't know what's going to, get out about any of this eventually, but I want to make sure there's another adult in the room. And it was a beautiful conversation. These kids were just asking really good questions. And that I kind of harkened back to, I was in 6th grade when the Gulf War, just this idea of like, will Saddam Hussein bomb suburban Philadelphia? It's like, no, but that's on their minds, right? So some of them are like, are we safe? That's like one of the questions. And then also things like, I'm Quaker, and most of the people at GFS are not, but this kid who did grow up Quaker, she's like, I don't understand why grown-ups always solve problems with violence. So we like talked that through. And then questions like, well, wait, who's the occupier, who's the occupied, or who's the, who's the aggressor and who's the aggressed? And so there were times in the discussion where I'm like, okay, there are things that are kind of understood by everyone. And then there are things where people might have different perspectives. Here's mine. Like, I grew up with more relationships with Israelis and now have more relationships with Palestinians. And here's what Palestinians would say. And here's what, Zionists might say. And tried to and I'm not Zionist, like very honest, but also like trying to offer multiple perspectives. And the kids are able to hold that, right? The thing that is most frustrating, the administration claiming that they're protecting children and really just not trusting the children or the teachers or the community to hold something, to have conversations. And then in doing so, in shutting it down and continuing to shut it down, then we're not able to have conversations. And it does become this thing that's like in the shadows. I kept being also personally targeted throughout the months. Parents, once my email went out offering to talk to people, parents started Googling me, finding the Canary Mission article about me and whatever. So there was one point where I sent an email to my administration about the Canary Mission article, being like, here's what is and isn't true on the Canary Mission article, just to help them out a little. But I wasn't able to stay there. It felt like the complete lack of integrity among leadership around, and they're like talking in circles to try to justify their decision to, quote the ADL in their emails or cancel. They canceled an author visit. We were planning to, in the first weeks, like late October, we had planned it the year before, but late October, we were scheduled to host the nationally recognized author Jamila Tompkins Bigelow. She writes gorgeous picture books. She's from Germantown, so she's local and doesn't have any books about Palestine. They're like really positive representation for Black Muslim kids mostly. And we were supposed to host her and they canceled it because she posted something on her social media about Palestinian children deserving to live. But that was the kind of thing that kept happening. And then I'm feeling urgently like I need to be fighting genocide, and I'm doing that in all my spare time. But then all my all the emotional labor that has to go into just justifying having a conversation with people, and then distracting me from doing my actual job and from fighting genocide in the streets. It's like I can't do this anymore.
It sounds like it's just, I hate using this term, but it's just bad education.
It is.
It sounds like it's shutting down kids' curiosity. It's removing education from the world as if kids don't exist in a world where these things are happening.
Right.
It's denying kids expertise. Of course, you should be one of many voices, but as somebody who has deep experience and knowledge of the Levant, as somebody who grew up as a liberal Zionist, your voice should be pretty useful to a school, to say nothing of the Quaker values that are being denied there. It's confounding. Why should they expose kids to amazing literature when they can cite the ADL and use Canary Mission to further terrorize you? I mean, that's...
And it's easier because the people who are and there was a group of Zionist parents who were pushing them to do certain things. And those people are loud and they're vocal and they're pushing hard. And like the people on quote unquote our side are like more polite about it. It was just, It's easier for them to go along with the folks trying to silence us.
We recorded an episode with Keziah Ridgway and Jethro Heiko that for very similar reasons had to be pulled. And we never aired because of these Zionist, I'm not going to say too much about, but nothing to do with the guests, everything to do with Zionist forces. And I'd love to hear in general about what is Families for Ceasefire, kind of similar to what I've asked throughout the episode of like, what are its educational goals?
Yeah. So Families for Ceasefire started in mid-October 2023. So we were just a few days in. A parent in Northwest Philly sent out an email saying, hey, and it was through JVP originally, she said, can you send this out to folks? Saying, a few of us are talking about holding an action that offers an intervention through this particular angle. 50% of the people in Gaza are children. That means the target of Israel's quote unquote war on Hamas is children. Can we offer an intervention there? And so there's the idea of highlighting children and then also engaging families and parents. I have always taken my kids to protests. I have 2 children, one of whom, by the time she was like 2, made it clear that protests are not her thing. They're hard for her in many ways. My other child, happy to go to protests. But either way, they've been to many, and it's usually we're dragging them along to the adult protests and trying to include them there. And so making a conscious effort to do things that both highlight children and make connections there, and also that can work for families here, both in terms of the kinds of actions we're doing, the time that we're doing them, the risk levels that if we're talking about like escalated action, that's probably not something we're going to take with our kids, even though many of us might be involved in that separately. And then also figuring out ways where the kids can have activities that they can do that kind of connect them to what's going on, figuring out how to talk to kids. Even for our first action, which was Sunday, October 15th, 2023, I wrote something up, like, here's the background of Palestine and what's happening in Gaza, that it works for everybody and works for kids. And we've been doing recently, there's a lot of library story times we've been doing, partnering with librarians at the Philadelphia library branches to read Palestinian literature and do cultural activities around that. But we've also organized lots of marches. There have been some things where we've managed to connect with folks in very small but meaningful ways. Around Valentine's Day, we did an action where we made Valentine. It was like a play date for Palestine. We had an educational component in it, and we also made these Valentines for specific people who we were connected to through somebody in Philly. And we emailed the pictures of those Valentines to them, and they were actually able to print them out. This was like back in January, February. Somehow she was able to print them out and give them to the kids there in Gaza and then send us pictures of that. But we did an action for Mahmoud Khalil where we made a banner that was like, from our family to yours. Right after he was arrested, it was for his wife. I realized that I knew his lawyer randomly. And so I sent it through her, and she sent it to Noor, Mahmoud's wife. And we got a very nice note back. So those kinds of like connections that we can make from families to families, like with kids. We've been able to do some of that. And we work with other groups. So the Jethro and Keziah are not with Families for Ceasefire, but there's Philly Parents for Palestine and Philly Educators for Palestine that they work with, which are specifically focused on the school district. And many of us also have gone to these school board meetings and testified and that kind of thing, but they're focused on the school district in particular. And we're kind of broader than that. There are times when that's where the energy is. There was one that Families for Ceasefire organized, and it was, I think they may have carried sort of shrouds that looked like children's bodies in that one. But that kind of thing where it's like actually exploring our grief as parents and caregivers.
As we come to the end here, I'm thinking back to where we started, and I'm wondering if Families for Ceasefire engages in any kind of work that might intervene in 14-year-old Hannah being part of the Reconstructionist temple and believing in this liberal vision of Zionism. Is that something that the org thinks about?
Yeah, I mean, we could. So interestingly, it's mostly, just because of who started it, it's mostly folks with young kids. And there are some people who have older kids, but most of our children who are involved are quite young. And most of the things do end up being planned by parents. There's some kid input and there are kid activities, but that is something we've talked about several times over the past couple of years, is can we empower more kids to take action? We haven't mostly done that yet. We are connected with some folks who do work with teenagers and have had speakers come out to various things. We try to highlight youth speakers at different events, but have not done like educational work for teenagers or anything. But then we just kind of keep going. And what we've come to organizationally is that we're a duocracy, like DO, which we didn't invent that, but we studied organizational models. And we really, if somebody has an idea and we have the people to make it happen, and then it kind of happens. And so we're able to mobilize fairly quickly that way. There's not a lot of process or bureaucracy that bogs us down there. And there are times when we're able to step back a little bit and have more of a strategic discussion about next steps. But a lot of it is really just like, I have a creative idea, I'm going to make it happen. And that's the particular lane that I think we're in for the most part.
If you don't mind, I'd like to ask one more question.
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe I've never asked this of a guest, because so many are like you, just involved in a million different things. And I'm wondering how you organize your own organizing, because we touched on Birthright Unplugged, Librarians for Palestine, Families for Ceasefire, and we covered some of your zines, but even that doesn't fully capture everything that I've encountered of your work. And I'm sure my research doesn't capture everything that you've done. So in the urgency of this moment, but while you have a life and a family and everyday work, how do you figure out how to build and fight while not being pulled in 20 different directions, while not being completely burned out. All of that.
Yeah, it's hard. It helps not to have a paid job at the moment. We've been able to make it work with my wife's job. I've had a little bit of paid work, like various things. And so I do have more time. Obviously, parenting takes up a whole lot of time and energy, and I don't always balance it perfectly. My 5-year-old will play, the way we'll play together is she'll be like, all right, you're the kid, I'm the parent, and I'm too busy to play with you. And you're asking me to play, but I'm on a meeting. And I think for me, it's being in community and being in organizing and all of that is what gives me energy. Like I think with some people, it's like, well, I have to do this to be part of it, or like I need to go to this march because it feels important for me. It gives me energy to go, right? It gives me energy it's like the only thing that can give me hope and keep me going in this moment is doing all the organizing, even if it is pulling me in many different directions. And there are times when I'm like, okay, I feel kind of burnt out, but it doesn't, for me personally, it doesn't last very long until I'm kind of back and wanting to do more.
Today's episode was produced by Yardena Ram, Samantha Haley, and me. If you like our podcast, please rate us, subscribe, comment, do all of the things wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find us on Instagram, where another Ed is possible. We'll be sharing more information about Hannah's work, as well as mutual aid campaigns she's identified. We're also starting to wrap up the first season of Another Education is Possible, and we have a second season on the way. We'll be making announcements pretty soon. You can find out more about that on our Instagram. Thanks as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.